I'm now going to bring it to Tony Greenstein. I've heard him called the enfant terrible of the pro-Palestinian blogging world, and I will just leave it there. I think many of us read his blog regularly. I suspect also many of us are, shall we say, sometimes circumspect about putting his blog on our Facebook pages, but we certainly always read it with interest and relish, because there are two things you know about Tony's blogs. One is he has got the most extraordinary grasp and historical grasp of what's going on. And secondly, we know, or I certainly know, that whatever his language may be, he is always politically correct. So, Tony.
Thank you, Jackie, for that introduction. I don't know about the enfant terrible. I did think when I was younger about joining the diplomatic service, but it somehow escaped me. So thank you. Look, I was suspended, was it 22 months ago, March 2016. I was suspended, they'd said, for comments I was alleged to have made. There was nothing more. That was it. I couldn't get anything out of them. They didn't return my correspondence at all. 2 weeks later, April the 2nd, I learned something about why I was suspended, because it appeared via the Daily Telegraph and the Times. That was how I put together that it was the anti-Semitism witch hunt. I had dared to say that Israel's marriage laws bore comparison with Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg laws, Jews could not marry non-Jews. In Israel, if you're Jewish, you can't marry non-Jews. But in fact, I was quoting from probably the greatest political philosopher of the last century, Hannah Arendt, when I said it. So when I was eventually called to an investigation hearing, I said, well, if I'm anti-Semitic, so is Hannah Arendt, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany. But there you go. That's one of these things. Fast forward to November of last year, I was in hospital having a minor operation, and I got notice that at last, after 20 months, I was going to be called before the National Constitutional Committee. So I wrote back, emailed back and said, well, I'm still in hospital. I want an extension of my time because, you know, you've taken 20-odd months. 4 weeks simply isn't good enough to rebut a 190-page bundle of gossip, innuendo, and so on. And they absolutely refused. They dug in their heels. They weren't going to give me an extra day. They wanted me out as soon as possible. After the debacle over Moshe, they really wanted to get their revenge. So in the end, I was forced at the beginning of December to go to the High Court and obtain an injunction. And I didn't think I'd get it. People told me I didn't have a case in the law, but nonetheless, I did get it, and when we came to it, the Labour Party barristers really had no explanation for why, after 20 months, they needed to get it over so quickly that I really didn't have time even to prepare a case. So that gives you some idea of the unfairness of the system. Let's be clear about it. Whatever else the witch hunt in the Labour Party is about, it's not about anti-Semitism. That is the excuse, that is the pretext for what is happening. And it doesn't take a genius, and I'm not a genius, to work this out. Why suddenly, with the ascension of Corbyn to the leadership, did we start to have all these stories, which actually started with Corbyn himself? That if you remember Jonathan Friedland in The Guardian, the Daily Mail and so on, that he was associated with Holocaust deniers in a group called Dear Yassin Remembered. They started with him and then they progressed. First Gerald Kaufman, who was a Jewish MP, what he said, he talked about Jewish money. Right? It's not my favourite phrase, but I Googled it in the Jewish Chronicle archive and it comes up 600 times, so it's not infrequently used, I'm afraid, and it went via Oxford and so on. And the answer, I think, is quite simple. When it became apparent that Corbyn wasn't a token or a joke candidate, some people got very frightened. I imagine not just the Israeli embassy, for whom Corbyn was a bête noire, but the United States as well. I mean, the idea of someone who was anti-NATO, who was anti the Iraq War, who was anti-American involvement in the Middle East and so on. I mean, alarm bells would have rung. I mean, if the CIA was not involved in it up to its neck, then it was a dereliction of duty on their part. I mean, what are they paid for? I mean, they've bugged and burgled and spied and destabilised throughout Latin America. Yeah, I mean, they're past masters of it. They've done it. They had all sorts of gladio schemes for stay-at-home armies in Europe itself after the Second World War. The idea that their closest ally in Europe, in NATO, politically, the special relationship, they were going to just say, oh, well, Jeremy's got elected, that's democracy, we'll put it to one side, we'll welcome him and so on. It's absurd. Of course, the Zionist lobby here, in conjunction with the right of the Labour Party, has been used by the powers that be in order to take out the left in the Labour Party. So anyone who gives any currency to the anti-Semitism nonsense is doing themselves a disservice, to say the least. Now, if there is anti-Semitism, and there's a certain, sometimes people use formulations which aren't particularly brilliant, there is a very simple reason why sometimes people blame Jews rather than Zionists. It's because the Jewish representative bodies in this country, the Board of Deputies of the British Jews in particular, do their best to associate the Jewish community with what happens to the Palestinians. Is it any wonder that some people take them at face value and they say, OK, if you say Jews are responsible for what happens, we believe you. They're wrong to do that, but not everyone has a worked-out anti-Zionist analysis of what is actually happening in the Middle East today and who is responsible for it. So we should be quite clear. My view is simple. Anti-Semitism is at a historic low in Britain and in Western Europe. It is not rampant. It is not high. It's a media concoction for a very simple reason. Of course, there's some anti-Semitism on social media, but, you know, no one's ever died because of a social media post. My father, who wasn't the greatest revolutionary, I have to say, he was a Jewish rabbi, in fact. He lived in the East End in the 1930s, and he was there at the Battle of Cable Street, and he told me that you couldn't walk down certain roads, Ridley Road, for instance, without getting your head beaten in because you were Jewish. That was anti-Semitism, that was real, that was racism. Police who deliberately ignored it or encouraged the British Union of Fascists, that was anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism today is minimal. Jews do not suffer from state racism. There are no Jewish deaths in police custody. People don't ram their cars into Jewish synagogues hoping to mow down worshippers. There aren't firebomb attacks on Jewish synagogues. It's extremely low. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's very difficult to discern it. This anti-Semitism witch hunt is an absolute nonsense and is simply designed as a means of attacking the left in the party and also those who support anti-imperialist struggles, including the Palestinians, so we should be quite clear about it. We have no truck with it. When John Landsman gives it credence and says there's something to it, he's not only talking nonsense, but he's actually giving a weapon in the hands of those who would get rid of Jeremy Corbyn at the very moment. And who is driving the anti-Semitism witch hunt, if not the overseas representative of the Israeli Labour Party, which is called the Jewish Labour Movement? Yeah. Now, the Israeli Labour Party, for those of you who don't know, basically formed the Israeli state, along with its institutions, the Histadrut. And it did it on the basis of Jewish land, Jewish labour and Jewish produce. And what that meant, and do keep me on time, Jackie.
I am. I've got my eye on you.
Thank you. I don't doubt that. The Jewish Labour Party followed a policy throughout the 1920s and the 1930s that if you were a Jewish employer, you should only employ Jewish workers. And they had pickets and orange groves and so on to keep out Arabs. Theirs was not a class struggle, it was a nationalist struggle, and it was a reactionary struggle, and it was a struggle in conjunction with the British Empire. That's what Lord Balfour was about. If you remember, Lord Balfour promised the land of the Palestinians to the Zionists as part of an imperial pact, a Jewish settler state, a little loyal Ulster in the Middle East, as Ronald Storrs said. And who was this Balfour? In 1905, 12 years earlier, as Prime Minister, he'd introduced the Aliens Act, the first British Immigration Act, which was directed against Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, fleeing from the Tsarist pogroms. So, I mean, Balfour was a typical Tory evangelical. He didn't like Jews particularly, but he loved Zionism. Because we're better to send the Jews that you didn't want than the Palestine. And that's as true today as it was then. And when we have a campaign directed by the Jewish Labour movement, which I say is the British representative of the Israeli Labour Party, we have to stand up and call them out. They are not socialist in any sense or shape whatsoever. And today, in Israel, I don't know whether you're aware, there's a great controversy because Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to expel 40,000 refugees who are black. Shame. Yes, it is indeed a shame. And the reason why, Netanyahu is quite clear, they threaten the Jewish identity of Israel. Now, I mean, it's actually true that there are thousands of Russian immigrants who are also not Jewish. They came over in a mass wave in the 1980s and 1990s. But there's a difference. They're white, they're Caucasian, they can be adapted, they can convert. But black African refugees from Eritrea and Sudan, I'm sorry, Jackie, but they are literally beyond the pale.
I know.
Yeah, and that is the reason. Yeah. Now, you would expect a decent opposition party, even the British Labour Party, if Theresa May threatened to throw 40,000 people out of this country, they'd have something to say about it. Yeah. But no, Avi Gabe, as a new leader of the Israeli Labour Party, says that the Labour Party there must support what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing. Not only must it support it, he's criticised him for not being tough enough. That is the Israeli Labour Party. And I've tweeted and called on Jeremy Newmark, who is the chair of the Jewish Labour Movement, are you prepared to criticise your own sister party? Because that's what they call them on their website, if you go to it. It's their sister party. Are you prepared to criticise them? And of course they're not. This racist witch hunt in Israel, and I have to say, what's illuminating and very heartwarming in many ways are the thousands of Israelis who have now been prepared to stand up. Academics, professors, airline pilots have said they refuse to actually fly them and so on. But amidst that clamour, and Haaretz has led the way with Gideon Levy and so on, have spoken out. The Israeli Labour Party has kept absolutely silent because throughout Israel's history, whenever there's been a war, whenever there's been an attack on the Palestinians, the Israeli Labour Party has been complicit in it. It is not, and it has never been, a socialist party. And therefore, for them to wage a war in our party on the grounds of anti-Semitism is absolutely outrageous. So really, all I would say to you is we have to go back and fight. And one reason for this, of course, for the JLM's activities, is that they think that anti-Semitism, the false allegations of anti-Semitism, will undermine our support for the Palestinians, because that's really what it is about and what they are about. And what I say to people is Israel is, as we know, an apartheid society. I mean, to give a very simple example, last year they demolished the Bedouin town or village of Amel Haran in the Negev. Why did they do that? So they could build a Jewish town on top of it, not to the side of it, on top of it. This is in the Negev, which is a desert, which 98% is unoccupied, but they want to shift into townships the Bedouin population, very much like in South Africa. And if anyone doubts Israel is an apartheid society, just listen to South Africans, ANC activists, like the grandson of Nelson Mandela, Mandela Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, etc. They say Israel is far worse than anything South Africa was. And I think they should know what apartheid is about, if anybody. So what we have to do, and I say, we take up the call, the Palestinian movement, for boycott, divestment and sanctions. That is the weapon that Israel fears the most. This is why Gilad Erdan has got $50 million slush fund to fund destabilisation in the West. I'm being called to a halt, so I say support for the Palestinians will be the best way of diffusing this nonsense about anti-Semitism. Thank you very much, Conway.
Well, I think what we need to do after that is rush home and Google all those references. And what I know about Tony, when I have done that, is he's absolutely spot on. He's absolutely spot on. And wouldn't it be great if instead of having to rely on Tony and people like Tony, like Electronic Intifada, other bloggers, other social media outlets to get our news about what is happening, both in the UK and in that situation in Israel, if we could only rely on our own media to actually do some decent investigative journalism. It's the same really as the way now that you get more justice going to the country's courts than you do from the courts of our party.